Even if this had been directed by some filmmaker who had retired, passed on, or was blacklisted from Hollywood, like Abraham Polonsky after Force of Evil 1949, The Killing would be considered a major classic of the genre of noir. As it stands, many are eager to shower with praise as another Kubrick classic, the first of them even. Actually, The Killing's influence on the Gen X era of Tarantino is worth considering, and the degree to which that film was one which later independent auteurs sought out, skipping over the seemingly more influential latter-day works of Kubrick, 2001, as in 1968, onward, with their emphasis on budgets, precision, and heavy cinematographic reliance, rather to attain something supposedly purer, or at least more, well, economic. One can trace their psychosexual development via how they felt upon being exposed to the films of Stanley Kubrick, and at what age one was at, especially if they saw these films prior to turning 20 or especially turning 15. Now let's not pull that thread any further, no. I do suspect that Kubrick was also a filmmaker who wanted as much authorial stamp upon his feature films as possible. It is not unreasonable to assume intense deliberation and consideration within every decision made on the production visible in the frame, especially in the works 2001, 1968 meaning, onwards. Not only did he have the power to do so at that time, he really believed in the seriousness and potentiality of cinema. He saw how much was being read into the novels of Proust, Dostoevsky, Bellows, Hemingway, Green, Joyce, or Hess, and he wanted a cinema or a filmography which was similarly deliberated. Incidentally, this, I believe, is what put off a lot of critics. It isn't that critics don't see what Kubrick's fans see in him nowadays. Critics saw exactly what audiences saw in 2001, A Clockwork Orange, Barry Lyndon, Full Metal Jacket, Eyes Wide Shut. They just considered it tasteless and overflowing a film beyond what the medium was allegedly meaningful as. Now, The Shining, I do think, went over people's heads. A lot of what people praise of The Shining now was probably not necessarily considered at the time of its release, from what I understand anyway. Though in any case, The Killing is a very good film, would have been considered one of the best noirs in any instance had Kubrick even not been involved, and it is almost as if some are hesitant to praise it, because they feel as though Kubrick's name would have us overrate the picture. A fair, perhaps, assumption to make, although in this instance, I would insist, certainly like Force of Evil 1949 or I Wake Up Screaming 1941 from the lesser well-known H. Bruce Humberstone, even less than Polonsky is, The Killing could have been considered a major worthwhile classic noir regardless of the involvement of the much adulated Stanley Kubrick. Potentially one of the most pleasantly surprising films ever made. One is familiar with later Kubrick. Oh, but how good is his early film going to be? Well, very good indeed, actually. Much better than his first two features, and whilst I don't agree that they ought to have been destroyed as he apparently did, I understand why such an apparent perfectionist had felt this way. In many aspects of his life, not just his films apparently, Kubrick was a very obsessive, anxious, and particular man. One always reads accounts of him, very socially considerate on the one hand, something of what we call a social perfectionist now. Yet when it came down to it, so determined to accomplish a task, it rendered him inhumane and even robotic. The Killing is really rather good stuff, and even if we were just citing Kubrick films for being influential, not just as quality films in and of themselves, The Killing proved itself oddly influential decades after its release, long after 2001, Dr. Strangelove, Clockwork Orange, Shining, and not too long after Full Metal Jacket had made enormous waves on the English-language popular cultural landscape. Over the next few days or so, we will hear about my other favourite films from Kubrick. 4 more of them, and mostly just so I don't have to discuss these much later. The thing is, so much is made of Kubrick, so much wasteful adulation and emphasis on how precise and difficult his films were to compose. There is an attempt to hold all cinema efforts as having to match or follow Kubrick, but to express any opinions on Kubrick, one has to almost ensure that you're kind of inherently gatekeeping other discourse on Kubrick. A lot of discussion about Kubrick becomes less a discussion about logistically putting films together and more about why it's so difficult to put films together. I suspect that people who don't make films, which is, most of the population, I guess, to be fair, it's perfectly fine. People who aren't filmmakers don't really, or good filmmakers, let me get to this point in a moment, they don't really they want these films to be as challenging and impossible to understand and kind of sorcerous and alchemical as possible, because then it emboldens them. Like, oh, only a genius like Kubrick could do that. Like, that's not beyond the capabilities of mortal man. It's like, it's easy to understand quantum physics than how a Stanley Kubrick film was put together. And it's like, no, there's a process by which these films, even people talk about how deliberated these films are. One of the most famous moments in his pictures, his Johnny was improvised. Kubrick initially, this is famous, Kubrick had been living in England at the time, and I think until the end of his life. And so he was an Anglophile with Barry Lyndon, didn't tip it off. I find this Bronx Jewish American became such an Anglophile. That kind of warms my heart. It's one thing for T.S. Eliot to become an Anglophile, I suppose, but someone like Kubrick, that's kind of always enchanted and fascinated me. Because Kubrick's Anglophilia is the Anglophilia to end all Anglophilia. Like, I mean, up until you get some comments I made about Ang Lee's perspective for Sense and Sensibility, the 95 film, probably apply to the Kubrick take on Barry Lyndon as well. In any instance, what I'm saying is Kubrick didn't know Johnny Carson, so when Jack Nicholson improvised his Johnny, Kubrick's cut. What's that? Well, I don't get that. What's his Johnny? His name's Jack. No, Johnny Carson. Who's Johnny Carson? One of the great anecdotes. I'll just share this. This is unscripted here. I'll get back to my lousy script in a moment. Oh, a 2001: A Space Odyssey DVD I once owned. I mean, I still technically, it's at my parents' house, so like I guess I still technically own it. It's just not in this place I'm living in now. Someone was hired on the production of 2001, and I don't know, it was like a sound engineer or a production designer, art designer, I don't know. He's walking around the set in the studio, as it would have been in the UK, and he's looking around for Stanley Kubrick, and he notices, he's like, who do I ask? He notices a man painting one of the backdrops, one of the sets, like a mat or something. So he walks up to him, kind of like, taps him on the shoulder, kind of asks him, sorry, man, like, did you know where I can find a Stanley Kubrick? I am Stanley Kubrick. And turning around with a paintbrush in one hand and a sausage in the other, half eaten, it's Stanley Kubrick. It's one of the most... This is how involved he was or wanted to be on his productions, but also how weirdly down to earth and sort of like mythological a figure he is. It's strange how like anecdotes seem to flow from people like this. They're so particular and idiosyncratic. Anyway, I think I'm done with this section here. Now we're going to move on to finishing my script. Me lambasting this other human being. Okay, so there's an embarrassing recording. This is me talking about the gatekeeping of like discussion on Louis C.K., like especially where like older people are concerned and they're saying, oh, younger people don't know what the fuck they're talking about. Blah, blah, blah. So there's an embarrassing recording of Louis C.K., yeah, that guy, talking about Kubrick. C.K., a man who jokes about the most crass extremes of human behaviour, became famous over fantasies about physically abusing his small daughters, also wants to gatekeep culture, despite being a completely hack filmmaker in his own right. Every stand-up comedian thinks they're Woody Allen, some grand artist. Listen, Woody is slightly overrated in his own right. Woody was no Bergman. We know that. Good as he was a director, perhaps. CK, what a nasty, unpleasant man. Even without considering the horrible incident which made him widely scorned, I consider him a highly distasteful and defective human being. So anyway, I will not gatekeep about Kubrick, though I will try and gatekeep any gatekeeping. Just stay off Reddit. Don't worry about social media. Go forth, do your thing, interact with the world. Don't feel sorry for yourself. Ever. You can make a decision to be very happy within some sort of... And even if you think like, happy's... That's capitalist realism or whatever. Like, it's not even. Find a certain spiritual equilibrium. Jesus was a revolutionary. Anyway, moving on. Hey, be more productive than me. Join Extinction Rebellion or something. Those guys are the real heroes, honestly. AOD endorses gatekeeping of gatekeeping, liberation theology, Extinction Rebellion and climate protesters and activists in general all, and Kubrick's 1956 noir classic, The Killing. That's this magical day.